My household is currently in our superhero era. My kiddos have fully embraced the superhero genre, so we are listening to Spidey stories and reading PJ Masks books and watching Super Y and dressing up in capes and using our various powers to defeat evil nearly every day. And of course, this means that I am constantly reminded of my theological objections to the superhero narrative. Now, I know there have been some attempts at a more nuanced and adult superhero stories, but the basic framework is this. There are some people who are good and other people who are bad. It's the good people's job to defeat the bad people, and often this includes a fair amount of violence, although luckily they tone that down in the little kids' versions. But it is basically the polar opposite of universalism, and such a vast oversimplification of the human condition. As Unitarian Universalists, we do not believe that there are good people and bad people. Instead, we believe that each of us has within us the potential to do good in the world and the potential to do evil. And so I am constantly saying these days when the topic of villains or bad guys comes up, remember, there are no bad people, just people who do bad things. Now, it's actually not a bad thing for my own spiritual growth to be naming this on a regular basis. We all need that reminder, don't we? The reminder that Dr. King offered in his sermon on loving our enemies, which Sonrisa shared a piece of with us today. In another part of the sermon, Dr. King goes in depth on the idea that each of us hold within us that potential for good and evil. He writes, "Each of us is tragically divided against ourselves. A persistent civil war rages within all of our lives. This simply means that there is some good in the worst of us and some evil in the best of us. When we discover this, we are less prone to hate our enemies. When we look beneath the surface, beneath the impulsive evil deed, we see within our enemy neighbor a measure of goodness, and know the viciousness and evilness of his acts are not quite representative of all that he is. We see him in a new light. We recognize that his hate grows out of fear, pride, ignorance, prejudice, and misunderstanding. But in spite of this, says Dr. King, we know God's image is ineffably etched in his being." For Dr. King, this belief that every person is worthy of love shaped both why he believed in working for justice and how he actually went about that work. Love was both the reason and the method for his work. And in particular, it was agape love, understanding, creative, redemptive goodwill for all. Agape love, as Dr. King describes it, is not at all a passive or sentimental kind of love. Instead, it is the kind of love that pulls us toward one another, toward the vision of beloved community that was so central to Dr. King. Agape love is the kind of love that it seems like we UUs are trying to talk about when we talk about liberating love, our theme for this month. It is a love that pulls us toward a better world, that sees within each of us a potential for good and evil and pulls us toward the good. It's the kind of love that, when truly embodied, makes us all a little freer. Dr. King firmly believed that the way that we get to his dream of beloved community is by making friends with our enemies. but not making friends in a kind of simple, lighthearted way, glossing over whatever hurt they may have caused. Rather, he talked about true reconciliation with our enemies, holding them accountable to their actions and turning them to love too. He believed in a liberating love, one that would bring us into deeper relationship with each other, and believed that that kind of love would build a world where we could all be siblings. Now, on my good days, I really think that Dr. King was onto something. I really want to believe that if we just pour love out into the world, that it will spread. I want to believe that love begets love begets love. And if everyone were putting love out into the world, that liberating love that sets us all free, then we would, in fact, be able to realize the dream of beloved community. It can be hard, though, to hold on to that faith that love can be an answer, that it can be both the reason and the method for our work for justice. It can be hard to hold on to that as we go into yet another presidential election cycle filled with hatred and vitriol. It can be hard to hold on to that when we begin our New Hampshire legislative session with a slew of anti-trans hatred. It can be hard to hold on to that when every day there is more news from Gaza of suffering and death. How can we, in the midst of all of that, have such faith in humanity as Dr. King had? How can we possibly love our enemies when, to be perfectly honest, they make the world really hard to live in? But here's the important thing to remember in all of this. Neither Jesus nor Dr. King ever told us not to have enemies, right? In fact, Dr. King was very clear that it is all of our responsibility to call out hatred and violence and injustice whenever we see it. And he was very blunt in doing so himself, naming exactly who was causing harm and calling them to account for it. Those aren't necessarily the quotes we hear bandied about on MLK weekend, but he strongly condemned silence in the face of injustice, calling it what it was and is: complicity. As much as I theologically have an issue with categorizing people as bad, I just as much think it is theologically wrong to say that love doesn't take sides. People do hateful things all the time, and we need to be able to name it as such. The answer is not that we don't name injustice, that we don't firmly take sides when hatred abounds. Love can be both the reason and the method for our work for beloved community, without letting ourselves slide into silent complicity. We can be firm and clear in our convictions, and also loving. We can name hatred and also have compassion for the pain that beget that hatred. Sometimes when my kiddos ask me to make up a superhero story for them, I try to introduce a new narrative. Instead of defeating the villain and then running off triumphant, I tell a story where the superheroes realize that the villain actually did whatever that bad thing was they did because they were lonely, or were sad, or they didn't have any friends. And when the heroes realize this, they decide to become friends with the villain. And the villain learns that it is better to be nice. Now, this is perhaps a bit more simplistic than King's call to love our enemies. But I think it is nonetheless a much closer narrative to our real world than that standard superhero story, the stark division of good and bad people. So often it is true that people do hateful things because hateful things were done to them, or because they are sad or lonely, scared or traumatized. What Dr. King points out in his sermon is that reacting to pain caused by pain with yet more pain is counterproductive. Reacting to violence caused by violence with yet more violence will never lead to true peace. This call to love our neighbors is not about being silent or about letting people get away with anything. It's about naming clearly hateful acts while offering compassion and care to the people doing those acts, opening our hearts to them and whatever pain they hold within their hearts. The current war in Gaza is a prime example for this. The Israeli government is doing terrible, hateful things, and we need to name that, to be very clear that the death and humanitarian crisis they are causing is not okay. At the same time, we know that Israelis and Jewish people all around the world have had terrible, hateful things done to them and continue to have terrible, hateful things done to them. We can hold the Israeli government to account while also having compassion and care for them and for all Jewish people as well. I believe Dr. King would tell us that we can hold both. It's not an easy task, of course. Dr. King never tries to claim that love is easy or sweet. None of that emotional bosh, he says. He even goes so far as to say that the path of love may not be particularly practical. But nonetheless, he tells us that the path of love is our only hope. He writes, "My friends, we have followed the so-called practical way for too long a time now, and it has led inexorably to deeper confusion and chaos. Time is cluttered with the wreckage of communities which surrendered to hatred and violence. For the salvation of our nation and the salvation of mankind," he says, "we must follow another way. This does not mean we will abandon our righteous efforts. With every ounce of our energy, we must continue to rid this nation of the incubus of segregation. But we shall not, in the process, relinquish our privilege and our obligation to love. This is the only way to create the beloved community. To our most bitter opponents, we say, one day we shall win freedom, but not only for ourselves. We shall so appeal to your heart and conscience that we shall win you in the process, and our victory will be a double victory." Love, as the reason and method of our work for justice, certainly does sound a little impractical. It sounds like idealism gone too far, unmoored from the realities of our world. And yet, if we truly want to save our world, if we have any hope of building the beloved community, where else can we begin but with love? That liberating love that pulls us towards one another. In our Wonderbox story, Ku said, "Is saving the world even possible at all? I am still not sure." Can love save our world? I am still not sure. But I do believe that agape love, a liberating love, is the best chance we've got. We know for sure that violence has not gotten us anywhere. We know that hatred has not gotten us anywhere. So perhaps it is love. Perhaps it must be love. Perhaps, as the Reverend Dr. King says, only love can do that. In that spirit, I want to invite you to sing with me our closing hymn, There Is More Love Somewhere. This African-American spiritual is a song of longing, but also a song of certainty. It speaks of a place with more love, more hope, more peace, and more joy. We have not found it, but we are sure it exists, the song tells us, and we will surely keep going until we find it. May we sing this with the certainty that there is more love somewhere, and that the path to get there must surely begin with love.